Hello and welcome to the Bell Mama Hypnobirthing and Positive Birth podcast. My name is Ellie Waddington. I'm a hypnobirthing teacher, antenatal instructor and positive birth coach, and I'm here to help you go into the birth of your baby with a positive mindset. Every week I share my top tips, advice and amazing birth stories to help you go from fearful and anxious about your birth to positive and confident. Make sure you hit the subscribe button and let's get into this episode. Hello everybody and welcome back to another episode of this podcast. I am back to full health. I was a little bit poorly last week, but I am back and fighting fit, and I am ready this week to share with you all the juicy details about my two births. Now, if you don't know me and my story already, I have had two children, two babies, and I have had two very different birth experiences, and it was the big difference between those two births that led me to become a birth educator, that I felt this calling to share this message. My first birth was quite traumatic. I describe it as traumatic. And my second birth was the complete opposite. It was the most wonderful, healing, calm experience that was, I describe as the greatest experience of my life. So my first birth with my little boy, Wilfred, he is 4.5 years old, and I went into his birth pretty much blind. I did no research, no preparation. I didn't do any courses. I didn't do any research. I didn't make a birth plan. I didn't even equip myself with any breathing exercises. I literally was of this opinion that we have been giving birth for thousands of years and I'll just know what to do. My body will know what to do. I can get on with it. And the medical staff will see me right because, of course, we'll go into hospital because that's where everyone gives birth. And it'll all just be wonderful. Now, we have been giving birth for thousands of years, absolutely. But we have not been giving birth in hospitals for thousands of years. Now, before anyone comes at me, this is not a home birth versus hospital birth debate. But you have to face the fact that when it comes to birth, we need privacy, we need dim lights, we need to feel safe for physiological birth to unfold. That is biology, that is fact. And that's something that you often do not get in a hospital where you're surrounded by bright lights and strangers and loud noises and people, and it's just not the type of environment that we were biologically designed to give birth in. And so if you are going to go into a hospital birth, you have to equip yourself with things, with tools and tricks and techniques to keep yourself calm, to allow birth to unfold. Otherwise you end up in the situation that I was in during my first birth, where I went into hospital to give birth to my baby expecting a natural birth, but the complete opposite happened because I hadn't educated myself. So I went into labour with Wilfred on his due date, and I'm quite proud of this because only about 3% of babies are actually born on their due date. So I was quite proud of the fact that my baby is one of those 3% that came on his due date. And so I went into labour around 7 o'clock in the morning, and I was just cracking on with it, I was just like, this is easy, this is quite cool, these contractions, they're intense, but I'm just cracking on with it. I'm just rocking, I'm moving around, and I can do this. So I just went about my day basically until the contractions started to get a little bit more intense. I was starting to need to breathe through them. I had to stop and do some rocking and some swaying and some breathing through them. And it was at that point, I thought I'm going to have to call the hospital now and let them know that I'm in labour and we're on our way in. And I called them probably a bit sooner than they do recommend, purely because where we live in Northumberland, we are incredibly rural, and we are about an hour and a quarter's drive away from the hospital, and that would be without traffic. If there were traffic as we got closer to the towns, then it could be an hour and a half drive. So I was very aware of that, and the staff on the other end of the phone were aware of that, so yes, they recommended we come in. Now, getting into the car was where it all started to go a little bit downhill. At home, in my home environment, where you feel safe and protected, I was cracking on with it and labour was going well. I could move, I could surround myself with my own lovely, comfortable things, and it was going well, and it was unfolding well. But then as soon as I got into the car and I was strapped in and I couldn't move, bear in mind that this journey was over an hour, hour and a quarter, I suddenly started to feel really uncomfortable and like I couldn't manage. I was strapped in, I couldn't move, I couldn't distract myself with anything, and of course, because I hadn't done any hypnobirthing or preparation, I didn't have a playlist, I didn't have any nice soothing affirmations, didn't have any sounds. I was just listening to my husband talking about whatever he was talking about, probably some really dodgy radio station playing on the radio, and through all these contractions that were happening, I was just clenching. I was just like holding onto the seatbelt as tight as I could, clenching my jaw and just literally waiting for them to be over, which I now look back and I just think, oh my goodness, Ellie, what were you doing? But at the time I knew no better. So we got to the hospital, we got into the hospital corridor, and my God, hospitals are so hot, aren't they? They are absolutely roasting. And of course, because this was December, I was in all my outdoor December stuff, I think I was wearing a rugby shirt and a gilet and some welly boots, and got into the hospital, and my God, it was so hot. So I was literally there at the reception desk saying, hi, I was on the phone earlier, I'm in labour, and I was just stripping off. I was just literally stripping off because I was so hot. So I got shown into a little labour room. In our hospital, they have about 20 individual rooms, I think, and they each had their own little bathroom, really nice little rooms, and I had a vaginal examination. Now, of course, I had no idea that I could turn down vaginal examinations. I had no idea about my rights. So, of course, I just got up on the bed and opened my legs like a good little girl. And it turned out I was about 5 centimetres. And at the time, I obviously was really happy because I'd been told that if I'd have been 4 centimetres or less, that I'd have had to go home again. Now, of course, being that I'd just been in the car for an hour, I didn't fancy being in the car for another hour on the way home. So I was really happy that I was apparently in established labour. I had someone to put their fingers inside my vagina and measure my cervix and tell me that I was in established labour, because of course I couldn't possibly know that by myself already. And yes, I was pretty much just left to it. My husband and I were left alone in our little birth room, and the midwife would occasionally just pop in and out, just, see how we're doing. But I was mostly just left to it. So labour started to go on again, because we were mostly left to it. I was just moving around the room, just swaying and rocking, going with the contractions and just doing my own thing, basically. I had my husband chatting away to me, and it was all just going quite nicely. Now, towards the end of the day, so I think it was about 5 o'clock, something like that, I started to feel the urge to push. I started to feel a bit of pressure. So I called the midwife, and she asked me to get up on the bed, and she gave me another vaginal examination. Yes, another vaginal examination to make sure that I was fully dilated and that I was able to start pushing, because again, we couldn't possibly know when we're okay to start pushing, could we? So yes, I was given the go-ahead. I was told, you are 10 centimetres, you may start pushing now. Thank you very much. Oh, wise one, I will start pushing now that I'm 10 centimetres. And yeah, so I was on my back on the bed, pushing. And bear in mind, as I've said before, I had done no preparation, no research. I had no idea about birth positions, what is the best position to be in to give birth. I simply thought that you lay on your back and you give birth in hospital beds, because that's what we see on telly, that's what we see in films, that's how people give birth, in hospitals, on their backs, on a hospital bed. But my instinct, everything about my body was telling me to get onto my knees, and I wasn't even consciously thinking I need to be on my knees. My body was involuntarily trying to flip me over to be on my knees. I really wanted to be kneeling to birth my baby. But this particular midwife told me that I was best just staying on my back. Now, again, had I known then what I know now, I would have told her politely, please do not tell me what to do. I'll birth in whatever damn position I like. But I was still in my good little girl mentality. So I stayed on my back. I was fighting my urges and I was staying on my back and pushing. And funnily enough, nothing was happening. And I kept trying, again, involuntarily trying to turn over onto my knees. But in the end, the midwife, she actually put my legs in stirrups to stop me from trying to turn over. And so for 2 hours I was there pushing and nothing was happening. So she called the obstetrician who came in, and at first he suggested that I just hadn't been pushing hard enough, that I'd been just dilly-dallying around for 2 hours. I mean, the audacity of it. But yeah, so eventually, after observing me pushing for a few contractions and nothing happening, he then suggested that we do an episiotomy and using forceps to try and maneuver Wilfred out of my vagina. Now, and he said, do I have your consent to do this? Now, of course, I was on my back in pain, scared, with a room full of strangers at this point. I'm not going to say, well, can you give me some facts and figures for that, please? Why do you think this is the best course of action? Of course, I'm just going to say yes. So I consented to something that I had no idea what I was consenting to. I had no idea what it entailed or anything like that, because I was scared. I just wanted this experience to be over. I wanted my baby out and I wanted this to be over. So yeah, I had my episiotomy, I had my forceps, Wilfred was put onto my chest. At some point the cord was cut. I have no idea when the cord was cut, whether it was straight away or a bit later. I have no idea when the placenta came out. That was just whisked away without me knowing about it. And so I was sewn up. Wilfred latched onto the boob and he actually started breastfeeding by himself really quite quickly, which I was really quite proud of, despite everything. And yeah, so he was dressed and I had a quick shower and I was dressed, and there we were kind of just left to it, really. And yeah, so I came away from that birth thinking, well, I'm healthy and my baby's healthy. Thank goodness that we were in the hospital, because they saved our lives. Now, of course, knowing what I now know, I maintain fully that had that particular midwife not told me to stay on my back, if I'd have been allowed to birth on my knees like my body was telling me, and I'd have been able to jiggle and maneuver with what was happening, then I would not have required those forceps. I absolutely believe with all my heart that I would not have required forceps had I been allowed to birth on my knees. But you can't go back and change what happened. All we can do is learn from it. So when it came to being pregnant with Annabelle, with my second birth, it was really coincidental that me discovering I was pregnant coincided with a friend of mine who is a hypnobirthing teacher. She had an unassisted birth. She had a free birth where she birthed at home in her living room in a birth pool with no medical staff present. This was an informed decision. She did lots of research and she made the decision to birth unassisted by herself, so with a doula and her husband in her house. And this story just absolutely inspired me. Reading her birth story, it was so inspirational to read how birth can be calm and wonderful and serene and on your terms. You know, it doesn't have to be filled with medical staff screaming at you, and bright lights and strangers and medical instruments dragging your baby from your vagina. It doesn't have to be like that. It can be on your terms and it can be natural. So I invested in a hypnobirthing course. I did all the preparation. I watched positive birth videos. I made a birth plan. I did all the research. So I basically researched all of the interventions that you could possibly be offered during birth and immediately after birth, and I put together an informed birth plan. And I planned a home birth. I didn't want a free birth. I didn't quite feel that was for me, but I did plan a home birth. Now in the UK, if you plan a home birth, you are entitled to 2 NHS midwives to attend you in your home. So that's what I did. And that's what happened. I went into labour at around 4 o'clock in the morning. It was, how far along was I? 40 weeks and 5 days. So 5 days after my due date. And I went into labour about 4 o'clock in the morning. And I didn't really think much of it because I'd been having kind of false contractions for a few weeks where I thought I'd been in labour and then it had all just kind of come to a stop and just nothing had happened. So I just thought that this was exactly like that. labour was just, coming on and off again. So when I started these contractions on the morning of the birth, I just thought nothing of it. And they were coming every 20 minutes and they were getting a little bit stronger, and I thought, this actually could be it. So by 6 a.m, I woke up my husband and I said, don't panic, but I think this actually could be it. I think these are actual contractions. And so he got up and started to move things around downstairs. He got our son ready for nursery, started to put the birth pool up, and just started getting things ready for the day, basically. And I got up and I was just moving around the house, just doing my thing, basically. I was trying not to let labour make me act any different. I wanted my son to go off to nursery without any kind of issues. I didn't want him to know there was anything different going on at home. So he went off to nursery, and then once he was away, then I started to act like I was in labour, if that makes sense. That was when I was kind of, moving around on the birth ball, and I was listening to my affirmations and my calm sounds and my playlist. I had, but early on I had like this really hilarious 90s playlist of music from my childhood, things like Spice Girls and Backstreet Boys, I absolutely loved from my childhood. And then as I got a little bit more established into labour, I had a playlist of cow sounds, because I work with cattle on a day-to-day basis and I find them really relaxing and soothing. So I had this playlist of cow sounds because that's what relaxes me. And so it was about 12 o'clock that we called the midwives and said, we're in established labour, but I don't think it's any time soon. I'm handling it really well, just kind of take your time and come over when you're ready. So they were here about an hour later, and they did a vaginal examination on arrival, and it determined that I was about 6 centimetres, and so I, was in established labour, but I already knew that I didn't need fingers at my vagina to tell me that. And I got into the birth pool when I was ready, and it then just happened it started to happen really, really quickly. And for the most part, I was just able to breathe through my contractions and visualize my way through my contractions, and I was handling it. It was absolutely fine. And then we got to the transition phase of labour, which is where it's the toughest part of labour. It's where you get a big shot of adrenaline and your body is preparing for you to birth your baby. Essentially, it's preparing for the pushing stage. So this is the stage of labour where you start to hear women say things like, I can't do this anymore, I need an epidural, I don't want to do this anymore. And usually when midwives hear language like that, when it changes from someone handling their contractions quite well to suddenly wanting all the pain relief, that's a sure sign that that's probably transition and the baby's not far away. So I instinctively then turned around and got onto my knees. Oh, sorry, I forgot to tell you, with transition, for me, it was basically a very long contraction. So all my contractions up to that point had been about a minute long, but this particular contraction just kept going and going and going. And this was actually the only part of labour where I had to hold my husband's hand. Now, for some women in labour, they get to transition and they might start to shake, they might start to feel sick, they might get up out the birth pool and go run and lock themselves in the bathroom. Weird things happen during transition, so make sure that you and your birth partner are on the lookout for transition. It's not anything going wrong, it's basically labour unfolding exactly as it should be. So transition happened and I instinctively got onto my knees. That's what my body was telling me to do, and I started to feel the urge to push. And I had not felt this with Wilfred, because of the being on my back and having forceps and all this. I did not feel him kind of descending into the birth canal, because I was obviously numb at that point. They'd given me the local anaesthetic and I was numb. So with Annabelle, I was there on my knees, started to push, and I gave this kind of like a strangled sort of yelling sound, because I felt her like it felt like she fell into my vagina. It literally felt like she fell out of my womb and into my vagina, and I was like, oh my god, something's happening. And so it gave this bizarre kind of yelling sound, and then I reached down and kind of had a little bit of a feel. I could feel this kind of bubble coming out of my vagina, and it basically meant that the waters were still intact, which was absolutely incredible. And then, so I had another push. My body just pushed entirely by itself with no input from me, and out came her head, and then another push, out came her body. So that was a total of 3 pushes, and my baby was out. At some point between those 3 pushes, my waters broke. And yeah, 3 pushes, and I was just in absolute disbelief that my first birth, literally I've been on my back and pushing for 2 hours with no progress, but with this birth I was on my knees, following my bodily instincts, doing what I felt was right, and she was literally out in 3 pushes. It was insane, and I caught her myself. I was the first person to touch her, and I brought her up to my chest, and it was the most magical experience of my life. And the midwife, because there are 2 midwives, there's one of them that was kind of next to me and was kind of overseeing what I was doing, and the other midwife literally picked up my phone and she was taking thousands and thousands of pictures of the entire experience. And my face when I picked Annabelle up out of the water and brought it to my chest, my face was just absolute disbelief, and I can remember saying, I can't believe she's here, I can't believe I did it. And yeah, it was just the most wonderful experience of my life. So Annabelle and I spent about 45 minutes just sitting in the birth pool, having skin to skin, just soaking up all those wonderful snuggles, all the oxytocin. It was just amazing. And my son got into the pool with us, and so he met his little sister for the first time and gave her a little kiss and a cuddle. And then so after about 45 minutes, the cord was well and truly white by that point, and the midwife suggested that I get out and that we cut the cord and that we see what the placenta is doing. So I got out onto the sofa and started to latch Annabelle onto the boob, and the starting to latch her on started to set off some more contractions, and the placenta came out fairly easily, just in 1 or 2 pushes. And so Annabelle and I just literally spent hours just on the sofa, just snuggling, and it was beautiful. And my first meal after giving birth was a very freshly baked Victoria sponge cake that my mother-in-law and Wilfred had made out in the kitchen. And it was the best cake I've ever tasted in my life. It was wonderful because I'd worked so hard at giving birth to Annabelle, and it was just such a lovely memory having that cake as my first food after giving birth. Such a random thing to remember, but it is those little random things that do stick in your mind, isn't it? And then so I had a shower and we all went to bed as a family at about 9 o'clock, and yeah, it was just wonderful. So that is me with regards to my birth experiences. So my 2 very different birth experiences, and there's a huge contrast between them. Now, I don't want you to take away that the contrast is between a home birth and a hospital birth. For me, the contrast is between being prepared and not being prepared. It's knowing my rights and not knowing my rights, having a birth plan and not having a birth plan, having coping mechanisms and not having coping mechanisms. If I'd have had a hospital birth with Annabelle, even after being prepared and having all those things in place, it still would have been a very different experience to Wilfred's hospital birth, just because of all the preparation I put in. And that is what I aim to do with hypnobirthing. When I teach people hypnobirthing, it's not about trying to push people in a particular direction. It's about making sure they have all the facts. It's about making sure they have all the knowledge, all the tools, all the tips and tricks, and all the confidence to go into their birth and absolutely smash it, no matter how that birth turns out. And with regards to home birth, I'm really passionate about home birth because it is wonderful. It can be beautiful. Now, my aim is not to push everyone into a home birth. My aim is for home birth to be seen as a safe, viable option. And I'm going to do an episode specifically on home birth a little bit later on in a few months' time, and tell you all about home birth and why it is actually safer in some circumstances than hospital birth. But ultimately my aim is just for people to see home birth as a safe, viable option, because sometimes Do you know what? Not even sometimes. A lot of the time, people write off home birth without even thinking about it. They just flippantly say, oh no, home birth is not safe. I want to be in the hospital where all the medical people are. And that's not always the best way to think. That's not the best way to think sometimes. I honestly urge you, if you are planning your birth right now, look into home birth and see if it is for you. Look at the statistics, look at what's available in your area, and look at it as a safe, viable option and see if it is something you might like to consider. Don't write it off before doing proper research. So that's all from me this week. I hope you have enjoyed listening to me ramble on about my births. I could have spoken for a lot longer, but I do try and keep these episodes under half an hour. If you have any questions, do feel free to email me, contact me. I am available pretty much all the time to answer your questions. I love answering questions about birth and hypnobirthing, so do feel free to pop into my inbox. Yeah, I hope you have a lovely week, and I'll speak to you again soon. Bye!